Welcome back to Thinking Readers, where children listen to stories and learn to think. This is day 8 of our story advent calendar. Yesterday, we read the opening of The Firework Maker's Daughter. Again, we practiced our summarising skills, and we had a debate between donkey and horse about the kind of father that Lalchand was. What did you think? Who did you agree with? Donkey? Horse? Neither? Or both? We also looked at something called synesthesia, the mixing up, confusing of senses. Do you remember we had the pungent noises? Pungent is usually used to describe a sharp or strong smell or taste, but it's used to describe a sound, and this creates sort of a confusion in our heads and contributed to this magical atmosphere. We figured out the meaning of the word pestilential through finding the word pest inside. The question I left you with was, how would you feel if you were not allowed to follow your dreams, but you had instead only to find a husband or a wife? I shared my thoughts with Horsey this time. And I said I would be very frustrated if that were me. I've always expected and grown up with the understanding that I could do both, have a husband and follow my dreams. How about you? What did you come up with? Writers will often create a different type of society where there are different rules and expectations, and that's what's happened in this story. Do you remember on day 2 we read Danny, the Champion of the World, and it said that all those jobs that Danny's father did for Danny were usually done by mothers? And that's reflecting the time that Roald Dahl was writing. It was like that, but the world has changed quite significantly since then. Today, our story is Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Have a look at the front cover, see if you can figure out what this story might be about. Can you see on there? Charlotte's Web. I wonder who Charlotte might be. Should we get reading? Chapter 1, Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father's decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it? Just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put the pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father's right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you ask me to control myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been born small, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, and a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house, and I'll bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start it on a bottle like a baby, okay? Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast. The kitchen smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on the chair," said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton at Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled. There was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid off the carton, and there inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning it pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arable, "saved from an untimely death, and may the good Lord forgive me for my foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "oh, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father, then she kissed her mother. Then she opened the lid again, took the pig out and held it against her cheek. At this moment her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed, an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's that? What's Fern got?" "She's got a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arable. "Wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery, setting his gun down. "You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat." "Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be along in half an hour." "Can I have a pig too, Pop?" asked Avery. "No, I only distribute pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arable. "Fern was up at daylight trying to rid the world of injustice. As a result, she now has a pig. A small one to be sure, but still a pig. It just shows what can happen if a person gets out of bed promptly. Let's eat." But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle and a rubber nipple. She poured warm milk into the bottle, fitted the nipple over the top, and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a doughnut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another doughnut. The children ran out into the road and climbed onto the bus. Fern took no notice of the others on the bus. She just sat and stared out of the window, thinking what a blissful world it was and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "Its name is Wilbur," she said to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Fern, what's the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern dreamily. The pupils giggled. Fern blushed. Chapter 2. Wilbur. Fern loved to watch Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, to feed him, to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was at school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze at her with adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box by the stove. Then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mrs. Arable fixed a small yard specially for Wilbur under an apple tree and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut into it so he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," said her father. "You watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. When he'd finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily into the box. Fern peered through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout. In a short time, he dug a tunnel in the straw. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. It relieved her mind to know her baby would sleep covered up and would stay warm. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road and waited with Fern until the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him and he would stand and watch until the bus vanished around a turn. While Fern was at school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she would take him out and he would follow her around the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur went into the house too. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would wait at the bottom step until she came down again. If she took her doll for a walk in the doll carriage, Wilbur followed along. Sometimes on these journeys, Wilbur would get tired and Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage beside the doll. He liked this. And if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked cute when his eyes were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly and smoothly so as not to wake the infants. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down to the brook for a swim. Wilbur tagged at Fern's heels. When she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in with her. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking, so while the children swam and played and splashed in the water, Wilbur amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and oozy. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which simply means he was born in springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell and would have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept. But her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased. He was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to milk. Mr. Arable was not willing to provide for him any longer. He had already sold Wilbur's 10 brothers and sisters. "He's got to go, Fern," he said. "You've had your fun raising a pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer. He's got to be sold." "Call up the Zuckermans," suggested Mrs. Arable to Fern. "Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can walk down the road and visit him as often as you like." "How much money should I ask him for?" Fern wanted to know. "Well," said her father, "he's a runt. Tell your Uncle Homer you've got a pig you'll sell for $6. See what he'll say." It was soon arranged. Fern phoned and got her Aunt Judith, and her Aunt Judith hollered for Uncle Homer, and Uncle Homer came in from the barn and talked to Fern. When he heard the price was only $6, he said he'd buy the pig. Next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in a manure pile in the cellar of the Zuckerman barn. And that's the end of chapter 2. Let's summarise. Who's our main character? Fern. Where is she? On her parents' farm, with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arable, and her brother Avery. What is the main problem, focus, or action? Mr. Arable is going to kill a little runty pig, and Fern saves him from an untimely death. As a result of this, she raises him until he's 5 weeks old and becomes too expensive to live on the farm and has to go to her Uncle Zuckerman's farm. I mean, you don't have to say that Fern is the main character. You could have the Arables as the main character, as long as you're basically getting the main sense of the story and what's happening, the top line of the story. Now, in most of the stories we've read so far, the narrator tells us what the characters are like. We were told that Edmund was grumpy, that Danny's father was funny, that Edward had a very high opinion of himself. He thought he was an exceptional specimen. We learn that Uncle Henry and Aunt Em are joyless, and so on. But in this story, the narrator doesn't tell us what any of the characters are like. And so my question to you is, how do we get a sense of the characters if we're not told anything about them? If I said that Fern was passionate and hot-headed, where's the evidence from the text? What do we have as evidence? Yeah, her actions and her language, and actually even how her parents address her, the dialogue between her and her parents. So what are Fern's actions that would suggest that she's passionate? She pushes the chair away, doesn't she, at the beginning? And then runs across the grass, so much so that her sneakers are completely sopping wet, saturated with water. And then what does she do with her father? Wrestles the axe from him, or tries to anyway. And then her language is very... What is her language? Passionate, isn't it? She's very persuasive. It's very dramatic. She says, "Would you have killed me if I was small? This is the worst case of injustice I ever heard." And she's so passionate that she almost makes her father cry. And he relents. He gives in. And look at the way her parents talk to her. What does her mother tell her not to do? Don't yell. And what does her father tell her? Get a control of yourself. You've got to learn to control yourself. So without being told by the narrator, we can see from the actions of the character and the dialogue in the text what they're like. And what effect does that have on you as a reader if you're not told something, but you are realizing as you read? You're having to work it out for yourself and build your own picture of the character. You're basically writing the story. You're creating the character from what's there without being told. There are other ways that we could describe Fern too, other adjectives we could use. Chapter 2, her actions and how she takes care of Wilbur. You think about all the things she does for Wilbur. We can figure out more about her character without being told. Now, injustice. You may know the word justice. If you know the word justice, you can figure it out because in is often a not. Injustice, not just, lack of justice. If you don't know what justice means, have a listen to this and see if you can figure it out. "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been born small, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not. But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." What has she already said? She's already said it's unfair, hasn't she? And she makes the comparison between herself and the little pig. And he says it's different and she says it's not. And she then ends up by saying it's the worst case of injustice. So you can link what she's saying at the end to what she's saying at the beginning. It's the same sense that she's conveying to her father. And in that way, you can work out for yourself the meaning of the word injustice. Have you worked it out? Unfair. Now, just as a fun observation, did you notice the names of the characters? Take Fern. Have you heard of a fern? Maybe you've got one in your home. A fern is a plant. It's a type of plant. What about aviary, Fern's brother? Have you heard of an aviary before? Well, an aviary is a place that birds are kept. It's not spelt the same, but it sounds the same. What about the name arable, Mr. and Mrs. Arable? Have you heard that word before? It's a word to do with arable land, arable farming that produces crops, for example, wheat, to make bread, food crops and other kinds of crops. I suspect that's not a coincidence. It's quite fun. I also feel, and maybe you feel this way too, it really sets this story in the countryside on a farm. It's just one more feature that really succeeds in making us feel like we're in this farmyard setting. Question for you. Have you ever persuaded your parents to get a pet? Would you like to persuade your parents to get a pet? If you have, what language did you use? Or what actions did you take to persuade them? And if you'd like to, what language will you use and what actions will you take to persuade them? You can practice on your parents, your pet, or a toy, and see how persuasive you can be. Can you be as persuasive as Fern? Until tomorrow. Tomorrow is day 9 of our story advent calendar. Till then.